So a couple questions that I got. Oh, you want me over there now?
Yeah.
Okay. So I was told by Harriet that I'm going to be part of her demonstration. So I have to face this way. Good, because this is my better side. So let's go. But I have to look this way a little.
Talk to the audience.
Okay. Talk to the audience. Water? Where is that from? Water? Oxfordshire?
Watlington.
Watlington. Harriet's from Watlington in the UK, and she has set a record, well, maybe tied with Manuela for the longest distance traveled here. So thank you. Thank you for coming. Now, this sewing machine has been all over the world, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that during your talk, right? We've been watching TED videos all morning, and I was asked a little bit earlier, why do we play them? Is it just filler? And playing the TED videos, I'll explain that we have to play 25% of our content has to be a TEDx video, or a TED or a TEDx video. And the reason for that is to get the content out there. It's to get the talks, to spread the word. Our speakers, our videos will be submitted to TED, and they'll go into the queue, and they can be played all over the world. So there's a reasonable chance that any of our speakers today will get picked up and played at any of the other hundreds of TEDx's around the world. So we are asked as part of our license from TED to play the videos. As well, we have to have a balanced budget. And some of the things that we put our money towards is obviously advertising and bringing in some of our speakers and the facilities. But the speakers aren't compensated for their time. So that's why it's very important that if you have a few moments and you see some of the speakers out in the audience or out in the lobby, take a moment and just thank them for their time, because they've come here on their own volition and at their own expense. And there's a couple people who have books and maybe a couple CDs out there. So please, if you don't have to buy anything, but at least thank them for coming and making the trip. How am I doing? I'm stalling as best as I can. More? Do I have to stay more?
Oh, you're doing great.
So can I go?
Have you finished?
I can be.
Okay.
Now I may go.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much. Harriet Riddell, all the way from the UK.
Awesome. Thank you. Here's a little portrait of John there. Quick. So, hi, my name is Harriet Riddell, and I am a textile performance artist. I travel around the world with a sewing machine, and I interact with communities using my art as a tool of communication. So I stitch on the streets portraits and landscapes of people that I meet. I started off at Hertfordshire University 5 years ago, and I was doing a mixed media degree where I was experimenting with everything, plastic, metal, glass, banging my head against a brick wall, trying and failing, until I started messing around with the sewing machine. My grandmother is a textile artist over here in Canada. My family are Canadian. I have a citizenship. And I had gone to an exhibition which inspired me to start messing around with the machine. So I started writing the words, love lace, and indoors, outdoors, because I always wanted to be outdoors. And then I used to always go to life drawing classes, and my teacher had seen these sketches that I'd been doing on the machine and suggested, why don't you bring your sewing machine into class? So this was the drawing he saw first that I'd done with a pen, and that inspired him to ask me to bring my sewing machine, which I did. And I'm not sure if any of you have done life drawing before, but the classroom is silent, and there's a naked person in the middle of the room, And there's me with my sewing machine, like, rosy red, because it's kind of embarrassing to stand out and make so much noise. But I really found a voice and a humor and a narrative and a style of drawing which I hadn't had before. So here's a nude. But then I went back to the textile room and I stitched the textile room. And then I thought, now what? So I went down to the corridor and stitched a vending machine that gave me a free packet of crisps one day. And the head of school came down and said, why are you stitching in the corridor? And I said, well, I'm stitching the vending machine, clearly. But I loved the fact that she had to interact with me, and I was almost in trouble but wasn't, and that my sewing machine and I could get away with going where we wanted. So I thought, where next? Now, my limitations at that time were a table, a chair, and electricity. So I was always looking for a plug everywhere I went. Oh, I can stitch there, stitch there. So I went to a cafe where we used to go for our greasy spoon on a Saturday morning, and Errol greeted me at the door, and I had my sewing machine and said, do you mind if I come in here and stitch the cafe? And he said, well, you must sit in the corner and pay for the electricity, and if anyone complains about the noise, I'm going to chuck you out. Okay, so I came and sat in the corner, started stitching, things I could hear coming out the coffee cup. This is Errol here in the middle. After I'd stitched him frying chips, he was delighted, gave me a lot of free food, and kind of welcomed me into his tribe of employees. And that was really amazing to see this sort of initially quite a hostile response, and then to be so welcomed, which I loved. So I experimented with that and would go to pubs and more cafes. I realized I got free food, and as a student, that was great, so I was going to set up in restaurants. I also worked in a nursing home during my studies, so I took my sewing machine in and stitched some of the elderly who had dementia. And what I thought was intriguing was the noise of the sewing machine, and just the sight of it evoked so many stories from these older people that reminded them of the war, or their mothers, or their life as a tailor, which later on I actually discover happens around the world. People are so affiliated with the sewing machine. It's such a kind of peaceful object. So after graduating, I was fortunate enough to get a job with a shoe company as an in-house artist, where I was doing portraits of their employees. And one of the projects, they sent me over to Hong Kong and China, and I requested to go to the shoe factory. So this stitch I did in a Chinese shoe factory. I was sat at the end of a line of other men and women behind their sewing machine, and they were sort of all working as a cogs of a wheel. They didn't find me that funny. I was kind of felt like I felt very free, and that's kind of the idea of my work, is there's no boundaries and I'm free, and these people seemed like they weren't so free. So definitely kind of the juxtaposition between us was quite clear in that circumstance. And to make money, after I worked with that company for 6 months, and then I went self-employed and started stitching portraits in the market in Greenwich. So I was doing 15-minute portraits. So this was a 15-minute one of a guy called Roy. And as I sit and stitch somebody, I get them to tell me about their life, a little bit like what happened with me and John. So you can't quite see that, but it says everybody has a skill to offer, which is something that Roy had told me, which I thought was quite prevalent. Anything that kind of resounds with me, I'll stitch that in, sometimes quite hidden, and use scraps of fabric to match what they're wearing. And here's another lady. So I often get audiences as well while I work, which I quite enjoy, because me and my subject will be having a conversation, and it can become quite intimate, or people tell me such extraordinary things, and then there's this whole audience behind them which they've sort of forgotten about listening in, and sometimes they chime in and start talking to my subject, and so it becomes this sort of very interactive way of working, and I try and let that feed into the artwork. As well as portraits, I started stitching weddings and recording events in Stitch as part of my business to make money. And then I took my sewing machine to India, which had long been a dream of mine since I was a child. my bedroom looked like a mini India growing up. It is the textile capital of the world. And I initially lived with a Punjabi family in Delhi for a month. They taught me the ropes, how and when to haggle and bits of the language, and built my confidence to go out there with my machine. I don't know if any of you have been to India. It is an amazing place, pretty busy and hectic, and I thought I'd take my sewing machine to the thick of it, but I started off in little parks and kind of took it easy and worked my way in. This is the stitch. So the first one with Taj Mahal, I got moved on by a guard. I was there at 6 a.m. to do the sunrise. Often guards and police like to create new rules that sewing is not allowed. So a young boy who was there toting T-shirts said, "Come to my village, you can see the Taj across from the treetops." So I went along with him and set up and stitched the Taj, which was kind of extraordinary. Their houses didn't even have roofs over the top, but you've got this grandiose Taj Mahal overlooking them. So you've got the women and the men working and cows chewing. Yeah, interesting. That's very much India, lots of juxtapositions. So it's hot in India, and perhaps the sun gets to your head, and I ended up on this cart. There was other men selling fruit and vegetables, pushing their cart through the town. So I wanted to stitch them. And so I asked this man if I could get on top of his cart and we could follow the fruit and veg men. So I said, "Follow that fellow." He did quite a good job. I'm not sure he's used to his cargo ordering around, and so I kind of just had to follow his route. But an interesting day, because you kind of create your own stage and open yourself to a whole lot of responses from your audience. So some people shouted at me, "You're destroying the market," which I loved, because I thought, how? But I think they thought I was selling the sewing machine. So people would look at me inquisitively like, "What are you doing, madam?" And I was, "Well, I'm making art." And they'd be like, "Oh, good art." And that was it. I'm just doing art, that's all. Similar to JR, that guy who was last on. He's a cool dude. He's always inspired me, actually, so it's quite cool to come on after his talk. This is the dancing Baba. You get to meet extraordinary people. He'd hike up his skirt and knock his knees around as a novel member of the community. I also met a man called Ashok Tuck, and he has won the Best Camel Decorator of the Year award 10 years in a row. He now judges the competition, so to give everyone else a chance, he tells me with a little wink. I got invited to a wedding, so I asked Ashok if I could borrow some of his clothes from his lovely little antique Aladdin's Cave textile shop, and he let me and my friends go and pick some clothes. This is the piece I did whilst on the trailer thing. So yes, then we were wearing these clothes, and in return I stitched his portrait to thank him for lending us the garments. This is Ashok Tuck. That's his hat. That's typical Rajasthani. Then I cycled across India with my sewing machine. Why not? I started from the east and went to the west coast and illustrated my journey on a piece of silk. I found this man on the way. He had a sewing machine on the back of his bike. So I stopped my bike very excitedly, like, "I have a sewing machine too." He was like, "Okay." He's a tailor, so he goes from door to door fixing clothes. And I took my machine out and did a portrait of him. He had to take a break from he wanted to get on, but I hadn't quite finished yet, so I asked him to hold his horses, and which he kindly did, and in return I gave him a spool of thread, so it was quite nice that we shared the same currency. This is a temple. I love this picture just because of the women and their saris, and it's quite easy to drum up an audience in India, especially of men, but it's so nice to have an audience of women, because they're often not so prevalent in the towns. It's very unusual for a girl to make such a scene on her own in India, like kind of make yourself stand out so much. So they were very inquisitive of me. It's always good to keep the police on your side, no matter what country you're in. So this was a nice police lady. There was two of them. They both wanted me to stitch my name, their name, flowers, England. So I just kept going. Yes, anything you want. She doesn't look that happy, but I think she was. It's quite intimidating walking into a town as well. So I stitched these young girls, and the lady here, she must have been the same age as me, so she looked after me. And I stitched these young children who were sat in front of me, and got them to pick the colour of thread and the colour of fabrics that they wanted, and I gave that to the lady who had helped me. And in return, she taught me how to teach this sari. I came out of the little hut, and the whole village was there waiting, and made me feel like a right little Indian princess. It was amazing. That's the piece on silk. So then I went to Kenya and did an artist residency there, which was quite different to India. It was a lot more, I got much more into the thick of things, working in the slum. This is in Kibera, which is the same slum that JR was working at with the eyes along the train tracks. And not everybody loved what I was up to, and it was slightly a bit more hostile, I suppose, due to people not having anything, and there's a white privileged girl with a sewing machine. Like, who does she think she is? So these ladies here who I was stitching, they didn't love me, but that's fine, and it was an interesting experience for me too. And in the end, I paid them some money, and they were okay. But it did make me challenge, like, what am I doing here, and what's the purpose of my art? But after doing this piece, I went and sat next to a train track, and a lady looked after me. She said, "Sister, come sit with me," not like those other ladies. And I don't know how she knew about those other ladies, but she had heard what had happened. So I got looked after by her, and actually I got so well looked after in my whole time in Kenya. Despite it being a challenging place to work, it was incredible and inspiring, and the sense of community there was amazing, which I feel like I lack a little bit in my life in England. So in that sense, it was a very amazing place to work and be. This is the panoramic view here. So I think the message really is to travel, don't be scared, be brave, and share what you can do. I found that sharing what I could do and teaching others as well as displaying my work was very inspiring for me, and what you can learn from others. And I hope to explore ways of exhibiting my work and traveling, and maybe making a traveling gallery or other ways to display the work, perhaps on the street and to a wider audience, so it's not just for a niche gallery world. And to finish off, these are just a few more pieces from Kenya, up in the rural areas. You can really get attached and integrate with so many different types of people. So I hope you feel inspired to go and travel and share what you've got. Thank you.